church hasn't changed. So when we understand the reasons for why they were uprooted back then, we know that when there are similar circumstances today, that the church will not abide by the saying of Jesus that we should render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. They don't believe in that. They will not abide by the Constitution. As a matter of fact, they have been busily reinterpreting it ever since the 19th century. I remember a message I preached a while ago in which the Supreme Court had stated that this is a Christian nation, and prior to that point, the Catholic Church had not some very good things to say about the American Constitution and Bill of Rights, but then after the Supreme Court made that decision that this is a Christian nation based on history, basically, based on the fact that you had the English and some of the Spanish and Portuguese coming over here, and those were Christian nations, and they were sent from their kings, and those were Christian countries, and so forth and so on. By virtue of that, we are a Christian nation. And then after that, they changed their tune and said, oh yes, we love the American Constitution. Why? Because they began to interpret it on Catholic principles, because the country had moved from Protestant principles of church-state issues to more Catholic principles, and the church began to see that in the 19th century, and therefore she began to move in that direction. So even when she speaks about being favorable to the Constitution, it's the way that they're interpreting the Constitution, which was not based on the principles that made this country what it is and what started this country off in the first place. So if we can go back to the way they have operated in the past, what it was that brought them to the point of basically conquering Europe and using some of the powerful kingdoms in order to subjugate those who didn't believe like they did. If we can figure out how the church has worked in the past, then we know that on the basis of Bible prophecy that the church has not changed, and so we understand a little bit more what we're dealing with. I was going to mention another text here in a moment. Let me see if I can just call it up in Daniel chapter 11. We can go to Daniel, let's see, chapter 11. And we're going to combine Daniel 11:31 with chapter 12 in just a moment. And this is talking about the king of the north here, which that's another Bible study altogether. But at this point is the papacy. And it says in Daniel 11 verse 31, arms shall stand on his part. This is talking about the king of the north. This is talking about the papacy. So in other words, arms, military power. The church doesn't have its own standing armies, and so they require military power in order to promulgate their doctrines. Arms shall stand on his part, it says, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily, that's sacrifices supplied, they shall take away the daily, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. All right, so this is what the church did during this time when they were uprooting the three tribes and also warring against the other Germanic kingdoms as well. This is what they were doing. They were polluting the sanctuary of strength. They were taking away the daily. They were preventing people from getting access to that, to Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary, and they were placing there the abomination that makes desolate. They were doing away with the entire thought that one could render to God the things that belong to God, and then to Caesar only the things that belong to Caesar. That was being obliterated, and so faith was being obliterated, and they were exercising a monopoly. Now it says, our arms shall stand on his part. There is a passage that resembles that in Daniel chapter 12, and it says near the end of the chapter, in Daniel chapter 12, and verse 11. It says, from that time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away. That's similar to what we just read. And the abomination that makes desolate set up. Okay? And there shall be from that time 1,290 days. Okay, so we can look into this, maybe not today, but some other time. But some of these activities were taking place back then, especially with the kingdom of the Franks and the conversion of Clovis, which did happen in 508 AD, in which Catholicism became the religion of the empire. So Clovis had converted to Catholicism in 508 and was used by the Catholic Church in order to subjugate the Goths and browbeat them into Catholic submission, basically. And that took place in 508. When you get to 538, a date that we know as the beginning of the 1260 years, the decrees of Justinian would take effect now that the last of the three kingdoms would be uprooted. Those decrees of Justinian that would make the Pope the head of the church and the corrector of all heretics would go into effect because there was no longer any resistance anymore. Those Germanic tribes were providing quite a bit of military resistance at the time. So these were indeed Christians, and they were not Arian. And so I'm just going to review a little bit about the Visigoths here. But they were completely subjugated, and they were forced to convert to Catholicism because of this marrying together of the church with the military. All of that began to happen. They began to set something up that would be an abomination. So getting back to, we're not going to discuss all the tribes because I want to get to the three that were uprooted, but just a little bit of a review on the Visigoths. Those were not part of the Goths that were uprooted. It was the Ostrogoths. Again, they were split into two by AD 370, with the Ostrogoths in the east and the Visigoths in the west. The Huns, that Oriental people, smashed into the empire of the Ostrogoths, overthrew, and in 376 overthrew the Visigoths. They were ultimately defeated in 451 in Gaul, that's France, by a Roman army combined with Visigoths and then routed by a Germanic alliance. On account of the Huns, how did all these people come into Roman territory? Well, on account of the threat of the Huns, the Goths were allowed to settle into the Roman Empire for reasons of policy as well as humanity, and they numbered also almost 1 million that crossed the Danube and were Christians, but allegedly Arians. Now, they ended up being shamelessly exploited by the Romans, who were supposed to be their protectors. And the exploitation got so bad that they were forced to sell sons and daughters, and they suffered so much. And at last, on August 8th, 378, they rebelled. And they squashed a couple of Roman forces there. And on that day, August 8, 378, began the dismantling of the Roman Empire. Now, what's interesting that de Kock brought out in this book here, in The Truth About 666. So you have all these Goths who were Christians, and some or many, I don't know, were Sabbath keepers. So these Sabbath keepers were flooding into the empire, and they achieved this great victory on August 8, 378. And he brings out the fact that, let me see if I can read the paragraph because I don't have it. I don't have it in my notes, but as I was preparing, it kind of struck me here, and I know which side of the page it's on. Oh, that's Clovis. Okay, it's the previous chapter. And it's right about... Okay, that's 3. There it is. He says, at this point, a question arises. Is it sheer coincidence that the Visigoths' entrance into the empire during 376, as well as their victory at Adrianople in 378, were followed so soon in 379, 380, 381, and 386 by pro-Catholic as well as Sunday legislation? All right, so these guys are pouring into the empire. They're winning this great victory. Many of them are Sabbath keepers, and all of a sudden, after they come in, you have all these Sunday laws that come about. He's saying, is this a coincidence? And then he answers that question by saying, we think not. It was prompted precisely by the influx of so many additional Sabbath keepers. Sunday laws do not occur in a vacuum. Often they are provoked by Sabbath keeping, for it is a reproach to Christians who in any manner break or seek to modify the Ten Commandments. All right, so another interesting fact there. So they rebelled, and again, 2/3 of the Roman forces were slain, and so de Kock refers to this as the Germanic interlude. So these guys now possess the knowledge that, in the future, they could do this again. They already beat them in battle once, perhaps they could do it again. So these Christians were providing a buffer militarily, and ecclesiastically and theologically, they were different from the Catholics as well. Their philosophy was more live and let live. Okay, if you want to believe that, that's fine. Just don't force it on me. Okay, and that was their philosophy. So after this battle, they weren't regarded as refugees, but as invaders. And in 410, Alaric, the Visigoth king, under his leadership, they sacked Rome, which that hadn't been done for 800 years. All right, so these guys were providing military, they were a military buffer. And again, they were not Arian, although they were Sabbath keepers. And one of the reasons for why de Kock says that they were not Arian is because they were converted by the Cappadocians long before Arius. So Arius came up with this idea that there was a time when Jesus was not, when he had a beginning, and God, and he was begotten in time. But the Visigoths had been converted by the Cappadocians before 325 AD. I ran this in the, let's see, yes, right here. Okay, maybe I'll make that bigger for you guys and see if that can do that. It won't blow it up. Oh, it'll blow that part up. Okay, that is good. That's Christ and Antichrist. Okay. That's the truth about 666. Oh. Okay. It was in the other book. Okay, it was in B.G. Wilkinson's book, Truth Triumphant, where he was going through the historical details of how they were converted by the Cappadocians. And Cappadocia was one of the areas that the apostles went. Peter went there, and if you remember in his epistle in 1 Peter chapter 1, to the strangers that were scattered abroad, and one of the places that they were scattered is Cappadocia. And so they couldn't have been Arians. And again, Arianism is this idea that Jesus had a beginning. So they couldn't have been Arians because they were converted prior to Arius. And he's saying a lot of this is basically Roman Catholic propaganda, is what it is. And this is kind of how history goes until you kind of do some digging and find out, hey, wait a minute, this isn't true. So the Goths in all likelihood kept the Sabbath, but the charge of Arianism is Catholic misinformation. And so I think we went through some examples of how, like in the book of Acts, you had the Cappadocians were there at the day of Pentecost, that Peter had evangelized them, etc., and possibly even Paul, since Iconium and Lystra and Derbe was fairly close to there. Okay. Well, the Goths insisted that the Son is uncreated and eternal, but they had problems with the Greek word ousia, which means essence or substance, because they associated it with Gnosticism. So here's what the Catholics did. They had this council in 325 AD in order to solve issues within the Trinity, and there were some that were saying that the Father and Son were not equal, and so on the basis of Greek philosophical thinking, they couched it as, well, they are of the same essence, and in Greek that's homoousia. Have you ever heard the phrase, there's not one iota of a difference? Okay, that comes from here. So, I probably should have spelled it out for you so you could see it, but homoousia means of the same substance. And there are two O's in there. After H-O-M-O, then you have another O, U-S, and then it spells the rest of the Greek word. But there's also a term called homoiousia, in which they put an iota in between the two O's. And that means of similar substance, okay? Now, what is substance? Well, unless you're kind of entrenched into the Platonic and Aristotelian framework of thinking, it's very difficult, all right, to really come to grips with what these guys are saying. And so the Visigoths basically said, and the Germanic Christians said, look, y'all can debate all you want, we're not entering into that discussion. And because they're not entering into that discussion, they're automatically then branded as Arians. Okay, all right. So, and that's a little bit of the background there. Okay. Now, during the reign of Alaric, the Visigoths migrated to Spain in very large numbers. The Vandals with the Alans had migrated to Africa, and the Suebi were unable to resist them. The history of Spain as an independent country begins with the Visigoths. Now, we'll get to the Franks a little bit later under Clovis here in our presentation, but he became king 481 or 482. He defeated the Visigoths in 507, after which they migrated to Spain. And so a new name, France, emerged, destined to play an important role. Now, we've often heard that the Alemanni are the Germans, but they were just one strand of Germans, not necessarily the most important one in the eventual makeup of Germany. Now, there is a modern country where their descendants predominate, that's Switzerland. The language of Swiss German is really not German, but Alemannic, all right? So then you have the Saxons, the Lombards, they'll play some, the Burgundians, the Suebi. But let's get to the three tribes that were uprooted here. They're the Heruli, the Vandals, and I didn't talk about the Ostrogoths here in the beginning. So let's go to them here, because in Daniel chapter 7 verse 8, it mentions it 3 times in Daniel chapter 7. So Daniel 7 and verse 8, it says, I considered the horns, and behold, 3 came up among them, another little horn. There came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And it mentions it again as you scroll down in that chapter in, let's see, roughly verse 19 to 20. Yes, verse 20. Daniel says, look, I want to know the truth of the 4th beast, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, and of that horn that had eyes. And it mentions it again one more time, and in verse 24. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. So this is mentioned 3 times in this chapter. So we will look at then the Heruli. Now, they were under Odoacer, who is classified with them. And the capital city was in Ravenna. If you kind of can picture where Rome is, you just keep traveling north on the coast there, and you will bump into Ravenna. Beautiful city, by the way. If you ever have a chance to do a great controversy tour, Dr. Domstig used to do them at the seminary. He's been retired for some time. Definitely go on a great controversy tour. The blessing when he did it is he would give you a book to work through, noting the issues that were associated with all the places that you would go, who the personnel were, so that you were kind of familiar with the issues that were going on. You could read about it ahead of time in the workbook. And he referenced the great controversy and all that. It was really a wonderful experience. If you ever have a chance to go, definitely do that. And so he's in the city of Ravenna there, near the coast of northeastern Italy. Now, the Catholics didn't like him because of what they called his Arianism. Well, again, that is Catholic misinformation. And when I started today, we really need to think of this in terms of what Jesus said. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. But in the Catholic Church, there's not a difference between sin and crime. So they regard Arianism not as just a sin, but as a crime. Okay, and that crime has to be punished. So there's no rendering to God the things that are God's. Well, they get to define who a Christian is, like with Constantine at the Edict of Milan, when the Christians were supposed to be getting all their lands back and being allowed to worship, but then Constantine got in bed with the Catholic Church, and they began to influence him as to what a Christian was. And at the end of the day, only the Christians that they say were Christians were entitled to all this, the benefits of the Edict of Milan. So they really make sure that they get in with the state and begin to twist their thinking regarding some of these subjects. And at the end of the day, you have no rights whatsoever to worship God according to the dictates of your conscience. So by the fact that they differed with them on the divinity of Christ was enough for them to say these people got to go. They got now Odoacer as well, the heralds, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths. Well, not so much the Vandals, because we'll get to them, but the Goths, it didn't matter. You guys want to believe that? Okay, we can coexist. But it didn't work the other way around. It did not work the other way around. Now, Odoacer, he also began to make some mistakes. He began to meddle in the politics of the papacy. And so the Emperor Zeno, who is in Constantinople, who happened to be a friend of the Pope, who's in Rome, decided to get rid of him. So the emperor eventually destroyed Odoacer through Theodoric, who was an Ostrogoth. All right? He basically promised him land, and he said, okay, you guys want land in Italy? All right, you can have this. And then go ahead and take over the heralds. All right, so the papacy, working together with Constantinople, basically militarily just took them out. So this was how the first Germanic kingdom in the Roman Empire was uprooted with imperial assistance and fell before the papal horn. It lasted for less than 20 years. That's on page 288 of Christ and Antichrist in Prophecy and History. After another defeat from the Lombards around 508, they survived for a generation or two and then disappeared from history. So now we get to the Goths, not the Visigoths, but the Ostrogoths under Theodoric. Now they had taken over Ravenna, so the city of Ravenna became what can be appropriately called the Germanic Church. However, it was doomed to extinction because it would not submit to Catholicism. Rome accused the Ostrogoths of Arianism because they differed from the dogmas of Rome, especially over the Trinity. However, as noted above, they were not Arians. They believed in the eternal pre-existence of Christ, but because they wouldn't enter into all these philosophical niceties at the Council of Nicaea in 325, they were branded then as Arians and troublemakers. Now, above all, the Ostrogoths would not concede the right of Catholic clerics to tell them what to think and do. Like Odoacer before them, they set bounds to the power of the Bishop of Rome in Italy, permitting none to be raised to the pontificate without their approbation, and reserved to themselves the right of judging concerning the legality of every election. Okay, they weren't going to surrender that. The papacy was moreover structurally incapable of accommodating religious dissidents, being monarchic, strongly centralized, and theologically totalitarian. Right, so they were not going to put up with that. One feature of Germanic Christianity is that it would not have complied with the Roman insistence on Sunday keeping. This church originated in about 250 among the Visigoths as a transplant from behind the mountains of Cappadocia. At that time, the Church of the East was still observing the biblical Sabbath on Saturday. If you want tons of evidence for that, you can look at B.G. Wilkinson's book, Truth Triumphant, about the Church of the East. Now, unfortunately, whenever somebody studies church history, we usually study it from the Western perspective and not from the Church of the East. But Wilkinson's book plays a major role in shining a whole bunch of light on the Church of the East. And that church was patterned basically after the church in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. It was basically patterned after that church. And so these are the connections of Germanic Christianity then. which were at odds with the Roman Catholic Church. When Theodoric heard the news of Clovis's alliance with Catholicism and Constantinople in defeating the Visigoths, who could no longer help him, he then became very suspicious and intolerant towards Catholicism. And so they ultimately then were militarily taken care of. And we'll discuss a little bit more about how that took place. Now, you've heard of the term vandalism, right? Okay, this goes back to the Vandals. But they weren't just, again, they were Germanic Christians, and under Genseric in North Africa. This is interesting to study in light of Revelation, actually, and the trumpets, the first four trumpets. The first four trumpets were basically judgments on the pagan Roman Empire because of the persecutions to the Christians, because of the things that they were doing to the Germanic Christians. And so this was one of the ways that God was answering the prayers of those that were being persecuted. It was these Germanic Christians that were answering those prayers. So under Genseric in North Africa, in 455, these Germans had raided, robbed, and damaged Rome. Genseric set up a kingdom centered on Carthage, this is in Africa, and sought to strip it of its Roman character, establishing Germanic Christianity as, well, the state religion. The Vandals were persecuted by the papal church, especially the clergy. 17 years before Genseric, under the mild approval of Augustine was one of the most influential of the Roman Catholic Church's theologians, thousands of Donatist clergy had their property confiscated and were banished. While the church members lost their rights as citizens, the country became filled with tumult and bloodshed. The Donatists had a complaint, and that is when persecution hit, some of the bishops had basically forsaken their post. So they had compromised. And the Donatists were asking for purity within the priesthood. Well, Augustine then had developed theological reasons for why they should be allowed back into the priesthood, all right? So compromising theological reasons. And so they became persecuted because of the fact that they differed with them. So the Donatists saw Genseric as a powerful deliverer. Even Augustine's picture of Carthage was a very immoral city, including the darker vices. The sins of sodomy were practiced there, avowed and gloried in. So into this very wicked and immoral city, these Germanic Christians came, the Vandals. And under their rule, Carthage was a city transformed, barbarous, but moral. All right? So they dealt with all that. They said, no, this stuff is not happening. Not the darker vices were gone then from the city. So apart from belonging to the wrong church, the Vandals also interfered with the politics of the West, even pouncing on Rome, and this was too much for Constantinople, and we'll get to how they defeated them in just a little bit. The role of Clovis in uprooting the Goths. So Clovis was a warlord, basically, that converted, very powerful king. He boldly challenged the whole Gothic Empire and threw in his lot with the Catholic hierarchy and with the emperor in Constantinople. The decisive battle took place in 507, where Clovis crushed the Visigoths under Alaric II. The expected Ostrogoth reinforcements from Italy never came in time. Clovis converted from paganism to Catholicism, but was essentially a man of blood and a seeker after gold. 3,000 other soldiers were baptized with him en masse, with the clergy enthusiastically guiding the process. Those pagan Franks that resisted did not survive. Clovis was the first Germanic king whom the little horn induced to apply a method that in common ages would ensure its ecclesiastical triumph in country after country. The church becomes accustomed to employing the secular arm for conversions. And this is what Daniel would say in Daniel 11, verse 31, that arms shall stand on his part. Once the ruler has been won over, he is used for imposing the faith on his subjects by gentle or violent pressure. A bishop who wrote to Clovis urging him to spread the light of his new faith to the nations about him, stated, "Where you fight," he wrote, "we conquer." So this is the method that Rome would use. They would, and they did it also through his wife as well, who was basically devoted to the Catholic religion. And so once they got him, then they would get him to fight their enemies, basically. In 508, Clovis struck a fateful blow against the Germanic Church. 30 years after 508, in 538, the Ostrogoths, its last hope, would also receive a mortal wound. If Clovis had not crushed the Visigoths and their Germanic Christianity, they could have helped their kinfolk defend the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy and then frustrated Justinian's reconquest 30 years later. If so, it is probable that their religion would have maintained its dominance among the Germans and utterly changed the history of the world. I mean, that's how kind of decisive this was. And they never would have, and according to Decock, probably never would have gone into the Dark Ages. So the year 507 and its aftermath in 508 to a large extent determined the shape of things to come. The role of Justinian in uprooting the Vandals and the Goths. So again, Justinian is the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. He was pious, but a persecutor. He desired to create a complete ecclesiastical unity, for he regarded his project somewhat as a crusade to rescue the Catholics from the Arian rule by elevating the Pope over the entire church, which was incorporated into the civil code. His political reason for doing this was to defeat the Ostrogoths. So in 533, he sent Belisarius, and this guy was like a military genius. He sent Belisarius against the Vandals of North Africa. By this time, the Vandals were divided by internal dissension. By 534, Belisarius conquered the entire Vandal kingdom and re-annexed North Africa to the Roman Empire. Soon, not only the Donatists were suppressed, but also the Germanic Church. This caused a reaction, and ensuing battles over the next 10 years desolated North Africa. In the end, the Vandals and Germanic Christianity disappeared, became extinct. So Belisarius' victory against the Goths. He sent his armies from the south and from the north. He captured Naples in the north and Rome in the south. With his forces depleted, only 5,000 men, he sought, this is Belisarius, sought refuge in the walls of Rome. Now get this, the Ostrogothic army was 150,000 strong. So Belisarius had only 5,000 men in Rome, okay? He was holding out with 5,000 men, and of course he was dispatching letters to Constantinople saying, look, we need reinforcements or else we're not going to make it. After Belisarius received the reinforcements from Constantinople, the Goths were eventually defeated in 538. Then Ravenna to the north surrendered. So the Goths were dying of malaria, all kinds of diseases, and so instead of going forward and conquering Rome, they retreated back to Ravenna, and that was it. That was it. Their power was broken after that. Once they retreated to Ravenna, that was it. The decisive blow was delivered. So what were the results of uprooting the three horns? Well, number one, consolidation of papal power and the 1260-year period. Establishment of ecclesiastical monarchy. The elimination of these three horns removed the closest religious and political challenges to the papacy, allowing it to gradually consolidate and extend its authority over the entire West. Another point underneath this, the implementations of Justinian's decree. The military defeated the Ostrogoths in 538. That defeat allowed for the actual implementation of Emperor Justinian's 533 decree, which legally recognized the Pope as the head of all the holy churches and the corrector of all heretics. And then the launch of the time of the end. These events marked the beginning of the prophetic period of the 1260 years, 538 to 1798, characterized by religious oppression of the saints by the Roman Church. What was another result? Well, the extinction of the Germanic Church. So with them also the loss of Sabbath keeping, because they were Sabbath keepers. The uprooted kingdoms practiced a version of Christianity that likely included Seventh-day Sabbath observance and a rejection of the Roman priesthood. Their defeat led to the virtual extinction of this more biblical form of faith throughout Italy and North Africa. And because they would destroy their records, most religious literature belonging to the Germanic Church was destroyed, leaving the historical narrative almost exclusively in the hands of their Catholic opponents. So this has always been the policy of Rome, is to completely obliterate every historical vestige, because those that can control the history of the past can also control the present and the future. What was another effect of uprooting these three kingdoms? Human, cultural, and economic catastrophe. The onset of the Dark Ages. The sources, de Kock's sources, state that the destruction of the Ostrogothic kingdom, which was successfully reviving and preserving Greco-Roman culture, destroyed the last real chance of preventing the Dark Ages. Also, mass depopulation. The wars were incredibly brutal. An estimated 15 to 16 million people perished in Italy and 5 million in North Africa, totaling approximately 20 million deaths caused by Justinian's expansionism. The ravaging of infrastructure. Italy was devastated from end to end. Major cities were sacked several times. The great aqueducts were cut, and grain supplies were terminally disrupted. Another effect, long-term geopolitical shifts. There was an opening of the door to Islam. In North Africa, the persecution of the remaining Vandals and Donatists by the Roman Church created a disillusioned population that a century later, welcomed Muslim invaders as liberators. All right. And so the Muslims took in 4,000 miles of cultivable land along the Mediterranean seaboard. There was no one to resist them. I mean, the resources were depleted, armies were depleted, millions had perished. They were ripe for being taken over at that point. The weakening of the East. Justinian's campaign to uproot these kingdoms exhausted the Byzantine Empire's treasury and military, leaving it vulnerable to future invasions from the Persians and the Bulgars. The rise of the Lombards. The shattering of the Ostrogothic power created a vacuum in Italy that was filled by the more backward Lombards, who would trouble both the papacy and the Byzantines for the next 200 years. Now, this was an interesting observation here. Retributive calamities. The Justinian plague. The sources interpret the subsequent series of earthquakes and the most horrendous plague in world history, starting in 540, as heaven's displeasure for the slaughter of fellow Christians. This pandemic killed an estimated 100 million people, and visibility decreased the human species. So de Kock is saying, is this heaven's judgment on the destruction of this Germanic Christianity and the elimination of these people? Is it just mere coincidence that one of the most horrendous plagues in world history begins at around the same time as all of this destruction took place? What's also interesting is if you go to the book of Revelation, when the mark of the beast is being enforced and people are being subjugated and forced, what do you get next? The plagues. So God pours out the plagues. So I think very interesting. So those are some of the reasons for why these people were uprooted, and what some of the consequences were later. Now, again, the church has not changed, and so the church does not recognize our rights, and so she hasn't changed. So we need to keep all that in mind. And they are reinterpreting the American Constitution. They might talk about it, but they're not interpreting it on the basis of the principles that made this country what it is. All righty. Well, there's the history lesson for today. Yeah. Well, may the Lord keep us vigilant. May He keep us studying. And this is an interesting tool, this notebook learning management, because what you can basically do is you can dump the PDF in there And you can ask it all kinds of questions. Like, for instance, what were the results, this is straight up plagiarism now. What were the results or consequences of uprooting the 3 Germanic Christians from Europe? Now, it will draw from that source, Christ and Antichrist in prophecy and history. And when it draws from that source, it will also give you the page numbers so that you can look at it and see if it's injecting things that are not there. Okay? So it's a very easy and handy tool in order that you can ask it questions, and it will provide you a summary along with the page numbers, so you can go back to the book to make sure that it's quoting it directly. All right, so we need to use AI against AI at this point. Yes, it's called Notebook Learning Management, Notebook LM. If you punch that in, and you can put in whatever PDF you want in there and ask it questions, and it will gather that, all right? Yeah. All righty. Yes, all right. So this is good for when, you know, you might be getting pushback on someone. Oh, no, they didn't do that. Oh, they didn't? Oh, okay. Oh, no, it's not an official title. It's not an official, you know, after such and such a date, it wasn't an official title. Oh, is that correct? Okay, well, how come they used it here, and here? Bang, here's the sources. So, yeah, Skip.
Concerning the plague, the Black Plague and all that, when you take a power like the Catholic Church that has no interest in the common people, something like a plague is inevitable, because they cared nothing about anything but their hierarchy. They cared nothing about caring for their people, the civilians. They were just left to throw their chamber pots in the street and walk amongst it and have rats all over the place. So a plague is pretty much inevitable when a power like Rome rules.
Wow. All right, well, we'll go ahead and have a word of prayer. I took you guys a little bit over time today, but we'll pray. If anybody asks any other questions, I'll be glad to try to answer. Father in heaven, thank you for the lessons of history in the past. We are told that those who don't know it are doomed to repeat it. And so we ask that you would help us to be good students, good stewards of our time, and that you will put us in places where we can help our fellow human beings out to know what is coming and to be part of the reconciliation process. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.